All right, I think we've got about everybody, so we'll go ahead and get started. This is going to be recording too, so if you have to get off early or you missed something, we will share the recording when we're finished. So, welcome everybody. My name is Kim Conrad. I am the marketing manager for Zybooks and Wiley, all things computer science. So, I'm kind of here to just moderate and host. We actually have the author of these two Zybooks with us today, so he's going to be running most of the show. Just a couple housekeeping things. You are on mute by automatically, so nothing's broken. Any questions you have, feedback, anything you want to say, please use the chat. We will look at it and I'll interrupt the speaker and ask your questions, or we can just answer you in the chat. After the webinar, you will get a survey from us. It's only about 5 or 6 questions, and it just helps us get some feedback with what you liked, what you didn't like, if we can get you any evaluation copy. And then lastly, I know my video is off. I'm really sorry. I actually scratched my eye the other day, and so I have kind of a weird thing going on. So I'm going to be off video, but I'm really sorry about that. But yeah, anything you need in the chat. So I will go ahead and start. And if you did have an issue, somebody just wrote in the chat about lunch. Maybe Mary, you can reach out to that person and kind of figure out what happened. We'll get you your lunch. Okay, so today we're talking about mobile app development. Like I said, I'm Kim Conrad. I'm the marketing manager for computer science. Dr. Frank McCown's with us. He's a professor of computer science and also the author. So he actually teaches this course, which is so wonderful to be able to hear from someone like that. So a little bit of a background about Zybooks. I think about half of you are familiar with Zybooks. Maybe you even use a Zybook in one of your classes already. But for those of you who aren't, the Zybooks mission and vision is sort of interactivity at its core. So it's a professor-founded company. These are our two co-founders, both were professors, and Frank Vahid actually still is a computer science professor. So the idea was that he wanted students to learn by doing and interacting instead of just reading, because over time, students weren't reading their textbook. He was noticing they weren't even buying their textbook. So something had to change. In 2012, he got together with Smita. They created the first Zybook, and now we have about 55 products in our catalog. So we've really grown. And then the mobile app development with Kotlin is one of our newest products. So we're going to talk about Java and Kotlin today, but we're growing pretty quickly, and that's one of our new ones. So the Zybooks philosophy is less text, more action. So instead of giving students walls and walls of text to read, we give them small paragraphs to read with a ton of interactivities, animations, learning questions, and we're going to get into that in a minute. But why this is so important and at our core is that we did so much research about the time that students spend in their books, and it was not very much time at all. So if we can make it less intimidating, less overwhelming, students are much more likely to spend time in the book. And then you all know with a course like mobile app, things are changing constantly, right? This is always being updated. So if you're tied to a traditional textbook on that 3-year update cycle, your book's going to be out of date by the time it gets in your students' hands. So we are a digital only company. Everything is digital. We do major updates to our content every 6 months. So we have the ability to kind of be the most relevant. So this is just a little background that I always tell people. I've worked in publishing for a few years, and I was also a teacher as well. And I think that we have our hopes for our classroom, and then we have our reality. And this is not to make any assumptions about your students or your classroom. I can just tell you that from years of working with professors, over and over and over again, we heard the same sentiment of my students are coming to class and just looking at me like deer in the headlights. They have no idea what I'm talking about. They didn't do the reading. So how can we help bridge that gap so that your students come to class and at least have put eyes on some of this content, right? They haven't mastered it. They're not developers or programmers yet, but they've at least looked at it. They've at least seen the terms, seen the ideas, and you can have a more interactive and engaged classroom. So that's the goal here. So keep that in mind when we're doing the demo. The goal is really to get students in the content in a fun and interactive way. So we want you to kind of envision a classroom full of prepared and engaged students, and we're going to show you exactly how to make that happen. So with SciBooks, you get tons of information about what your students are doing. When we get into the product, we'll kind of show you what we mean by participation activity, but you can actually assign these with due dates. So you can really hold students accountable for doing this reading before they come to class. And then you can dig in and see how they did. So if you can imagine you're walking into your lecture or logging on and you're lecturing about CPU scheduling today. I know this is a different topic, but 95% of the students at least have looked at the content. I mean, that's a huge improvement over probably what was happening before. So you have tons of insight. We have an analytics feature that gives you even more insight into your students' behavior, either as a class or by individual students. So how much time they were spending, how many attempts they've been doing, tons more than you get from a traditional book or ebook. And then SciBooks is totally customizable because it's all digital. So you can rearrange content, you can add your own content, you can actually combine books. So if you teach the mobile app dev with Java and you need a Java review, you can actually pull 3 or 4 chapters from our programming in Java book or anything you want. You can kind of combine and make a custom book. And because it's all digital, it's really inexpensive to do. It's like an instant thing you can rearrange. So that's awesome. We'll get into that too, but just always want to highlight that. And then it works. So we were professor founded. Professors do research. They love to test their theories. So that's what we did. We brought SciBooks to the market. We did a bunch of tests and research, and it really, really did improve all across the board. So the biggest one is how to motivate students to read. This is sort of the, this earnestly completed and points awarded down here on the right. This is what we found, that if you award some points, students will do the work and they will do it earnestly because they know that if they just spend some time in the product, they're going to get 5 or 10% of their overall course grade. So you can assign these for a grade. We really recommend that you do that so that they actually do it. And then what we always say is you say 5 to 10%, but the student hears a letter grade, right? So if I just sit down every week and read my mobile app SciBook, I can go from a C to a B, or I can go from a D to a C. So it's really important to understand that when we talk about this, it is meant to be worth points. And we can talk about the details of how Frank does that in his class maybe, but just some interesting research we've completed. So we're going to hop right into the actual book. I'm going to pass it over to Frank. Does anyone have like basic questions about SciBooks or our background? Anything I can answer? All right, I think we might be good. So you want to go ahead, Frank, and we'll dive right into the actual books. Please ask questions as they come up in the chat and we'll moderate it. So.
Okay. Good to have everyone on the call here. I'm currently sharing my Java book and also the Kotlin book. So I teach computer science at Harding University. I'm out here in Arkansas. It was interesting to see the chat messages and see where all of you are located. I've been teaching Android application development pretty much since Android first came out. So I've seen how things have evolved and changed over time. And of course, Android is one of those things that's constantly changing, and it's actually rather challenging to teach, and it's challenging to actually write a book on the topic because the underlying technology changes so frequently. I've taught from the SciBook C++, the web programming, the operating system SciBooks for a few years, and also developed the mobile application development book originally in Java, and have taught from that from a few years, and then also just recently released the Kotlin version. And this semester, I'm teaching with the Kotlin version in my upper level application development programming class. So I'm happy to share with you my own personal experiences, and I'll kind of talk about that some, but if you have questions about it, I'd be happy to be happy to answer anything that you might ask. I'll start with the Java book, and really both of these books are very, very similar. They've got the same chapters. The only difference here is that the Java book has got a chapter called Legacy, where I've moved some of the content that was once more relevant and has sort of been deprecated or replaced into that particular chapter. So there's still some instructors that may want to cover some of that material, but it's really not what, the current methodology that Google would recommend for building Android apps. The mobile book, the Kotlin version of the book has got an additional chapter here on Kotlin, just because it's assumed that most universities are not teaching Kotlin. Many are teaching Java, but students probably will go into this class having either had Java or maybe Python or C++, but having never seen Kotlin at all. So the first chapter here on Kotlin is a very quick run through on the language. You can see, just like a typical book, this is broken up into chapters and sections. And so this would be the first section here in the Kotlin book. And right off the bat, we just talk about, what is an IDE? We talk about what is bytecode, a Java virtual machine, because even though we're writing Kotlin, Kotlin gets compiled into bytecode, just like Java gets compiled into bytecode. And then that code gets executed by a Java virtual machine. So chapter 1 is all about just learning the basic syntax of Kotlin. That's what I probably spent a couple of weeks this semester just teaching the Kotlin language. We used the IntelliJ IDEA by JetBrains in order to do our development work. And then after those couple of weeks, then we moved into Android application development using Android Studio. So, a Zybook has very minimal amount of text. We try to clearly define any terms that we're going to be using. Try not to make assumptions that everyone knows about certain terms. So here we've got 3 different definitions. We have animations, and these animations are broken up into different steps where we have a caption. Students can rewatch any particular step at any particular time if they want to rewatch it. And then they just kind of advance through each of the steps. And once they've completed watching the animation, there's a little checkbox that appears up here. And that just means that Zybooks has recorded they have completed that particular participation activity. So we call these participation activities because students will be participating. They're interacting with the Zybook. And the instructors can determine or can automatically download how many of these participation activities have been completed. So in my classes, I generally give about 5% credit for completing these participation activities before my students come to class. And like I said, I've taught from many different Zybooks for several years now. And what I pretty much find is that nearly every one of my students completes these participation activities before coming to class. And the great thing about that is I can assume that they've all got some exposure. They've seen some of these terms, some of these concepts, and it's not brand new. So often I'll jump straight into doing questions within the class, like polling questions, where I'll put up a programming problem, ask them their understanding of it, and I can immediately tell, if people have been grasping a concept or the concepts they're struggling with. But I don't have to go straight into, okay, let me first define this term and let me now define this term. I can go at a much quicker pace just because the students have already spent time with the Zybook. So after an animation, there might be things like, try this. This is saying to try to write some code in the Kotlin playground. This is just a website that's provided by a third party to be able to run Kotlin code. And then we have additional participation activities. These are just some true false questions. And we give feedback. If a student gets the answer wrong, they can still choose other options to get it correct. There's no penalty for getting answers incorrect. And the feedback that we give, we've very carefully written that to be able to help the student who is learning to be able to discover what the right answer is. And again, all these participation activities are tracked. And so instructors can download this and determine if their students are reading or not. Here's another subsection about program structure. and another animation that the students would walk through. And then we've got multiple choice questions here. And again, if the students gets the incorrect answer, they can read the feedback. Hopefully from that feedback, they can then get the correct answer, and there's no penalties for getting incorrect answers. So after chapter 1, then we have a number of different chapters here. Generally, students would want to move on to chapter 2, chapter 3, and so on. But some of these later chapters, you might feel like, hey, I don't want to teach from this particular topic, or I'd rather move this topic in front of this other. And so you definitely have full control of your Zybook, and you can rearrange chapters, you can rearrange sections. In fact, just yesterday, I took a section from the graphics, animation, and sound. I took a section from here, and I actually moved it up into chapter 5 because I wanted to show my students how to create a custom view, but then also how to use touch. And so we're going to create like a little painting program on Monday. So chapter 2, this would be actually chapter 1 in the Java book. I'll just kind of bounce back here to the Java book. This goes into the basics of how you develop an Android application, kind of introducing what is a mobile device, and you know, the different types of platforms, Android and iOS being the two major ones, the popularity of those platforms. And then we start getting into kind of the nitty gritty of Android application development. So we learn about, you know, how these Android APIs have evolved over the years. Currently, we're using version 12, which is API level 31. And I spent some time talking about that with my students, just how that evolution occurs and what that means as your API is continually changing. And there's even some information here about what's kind of underlining all of this. You know, you develop your Android, your code in Java, but how does that make it onto the machine? What is actually executing the code? It's this thing called the ART, the Android runtime. Then we start learning about Android Studio. We learn about, you know, the makeup of a project, what types of files go into an APK. This is the file that gets installed on an Android emulator or a physical device. And then we also start talking about emulators. And so I want students to be able to run an emulator and be familiar with how it works. And then we move into the Pizza Party app. So every chapter has got 1 or 2, sometimes even 3 example apps. And so these apps, we just kind of walk the student through how to create them. In this case, we're starting with a very simple app that asks for how many people are going to be attending your pizza party, how hungry are they, and then we can do some calculations, and this will just tell us how many pizzas we should order. So all of the code is given, and step-by-step instructions on how to create this and run it inside Android Studio and on a emulator. Here we talk about the layout editor, how to change the UI, the visual appearance of the app. If you've never taught Android application development before, there's a lot of XML that's involved. This is the XML that describes the user interface for the main screen. And then there's some Java code. And so this is a very typical animation that students will see, where we show them some code and we highlight different parts of the code and explain what that code is doing. I would say there's a little bit of a learning curve. Some of you would probably agree with me when learning how to program with Android. There's a lot of functions and methods to learn about in order to interact with the Android SDK. And so having these little code snippets where we kind of dissect it and go step by step, show what's going on, this is really helpful for the student to see, oh, okay, this function's called, this is what this function does. It expands the XML, which determines the user interface. And then when my user is interacting here with the application, what functions get called. So just kind of a step-by-step type of animation. And then of course the learning questions that follow that just try to help the student further understand what the code does, what it could do, where there could be potential problems in the code. Those are all the types of questions that generally the student will encounter after an animation. So you can see just some different types of example applications we have. Actually, chapter 2 introduces a number of things about creating user interfaces, different types of widgets. Students are actually encouraged to make some changes to the Pizza Party app as they go through chapter 2. Chapter 3 introduces activities and intents, and they create a lights out application. This is just a very fun and simple game. And this involves multiple activities, one activity where they can change the color of the game board, and another activity that gives instructions on the game. In chapter 4, they develop a dice roller app. This demonstrates a number of concepts. For instance, the app bar, creating menus, creating dialogues, context menus, and then even handling touch. So there's some touch interface as part of this application. Chapter 5 on fragments is a chapter that an instructor actually could skip. I know some instructors find fragments may be overly complicated. Fragments are really useful when you're trying to create certain types of applications that might modify and work well on a larger screen, like on a tablet, for instance. And they're even used for navigation, some components like the navigation component that allows you to switch screens. So I've introduced here a number of what we call Jetpack components, and these are some of the newer components that Android has introduced to simplify application development. In this case, the navigation component helps you define a graph that shows what types of fragments should be displayed on the screens. And so this chapter is all about using the navigation component. It introduces the recycler view for scrolling through different things. And if you really wanted to, you actually could skip this chapter. I went ahead and made a purposeful decision that the rest of the example apps would not use fragments, just because I knew there would be some instructors that chose not to cover that particular chapter. Let me just kind of close out here. Chapter 6, this one creates a study helper app. This one is using a room database. A room database runs on top of SQLite. So it gives students some opportunity to write an application that's got a database or structured data and how to get that data out using Room. It also uses a number of newer concepts, things like view models and live data. It shows how to create application settings. These are some card views that it's using here on the main page. So there's a lot of really interesting things that are being done in chapter 6. Chapter 7 is more about background tasks, running long running tasks in the background. They build a timer app, for instance, and this timer app can even show notifications from the status bar. Chapter 8 is all about graphics. They build a kind of a fun dots type of app. We call it Dotty, where they were able to connect the dots. And this actually introduces all kinds of fun animations and sounds. So it ends up getting more animated than this little screen here is showing. And then chapter 9, there's a rollerball app, which shows how to use the accelerometer. There's a Photo Express app, which shows how to interact with your camera, take pictures, modify the pictures if you wanted to do some types of transformations on the image and save those pictures. There's the Find Me app, which allows you to interact with Google Maps and location data. And then finally, there's chapter 10 on testing. And this is a chapter that I've actually never been able to teach. There's really more content in this book than you could possibly cover in a semester unless you were just flying through it. So I wanted to put more content in there than you could cover, just to give instructors the ability to choose what types of content they wanted to cover. Some might decide they don't want to do graphics. Some might decide they don't want to do background tasks and threading, because that's kind of complicated. So you can kind of pick and choose and whatever meets your learning outcomes for your particular course. So let me just real quickly show you here in the reporting tab.
Before you go through reporting, sorry, somebody asked about REST API for mobile application. Does that make sense to you? Do we have a?
Sure, yeah. So in the chapter here on working with data, there's a section here called Web APIs. And this actually introduces the concept of a RESTful Web API. We've developed a very simple one at zyBooks that you can actually use. Your study helper app can make a REST request to our API and just ask what study questions are available, and it will send back a bunch of topics. And then from that list of topics, you can choose one to import, and then it will make a request to the API, download a bunch of different questions, and they'll be imported into your app. So there's some coverage here about how to interact with that. I think there might even be like an example. Yeah, here's an example where these are different topics that our API provides. You can choose a topic, downloads it, and then it's part of your list of study questions.
Great. I think that's the only question so far that we weren't able to answer. So.
Okay. Yeah, if you guys have questions, feel free to put them in the chat there. This reporting tab, this is how you can track what your students are doing. So I'll create an assignment. I'll say, okay, I want my students to maybe read the first, let's say, 4 sections of chapter 1, and I'll give it a particular assignment name and a due date and save that. I'll do that ahead of time before that class period where I actually want to be teaching from these topics. And then I can go here to reporting, and I can take a look and say, well, okay, well, what percentage of my students have completed the participation activities? I can change the dates in which I'm looking for completion of those activities. I can actually even, break this down into different types of activities, which type of activities have been completed or not completed. And I actually have all of my participation activities automatically imported into Canvas, the LMS that I use. So I never actually even have to manually run these reports. It just automatically uploads into Canvas. And so Canvas tracks my students and tells me whether they've done the reading or not. And like I've said, I pretty much every class period have all of my students do the reading ahead of time. Occasionally I'll have a student who forgets. And so at the end of the semester, I normally will drop 2 or so of their reading assignments, just because I know life happens and sometimes we forget, and sometimes we just can't get things done before class. And so I don't want my students to stress out too much. But pretty much every single class period, I have 2, 3, 4 sections that I want them to read before they come to class. So I create these assignments, put them into Canvas. I can link them directly to the zyBook, so the upload process happens automatically for me. Those are the things I think I had on my mind that I wanted to show.
That's great. Just a few things. So you mentioned that you integrate with Canvas. Just so everybody knows, we do have full integration with Blackboard, Canvas, Brightspace. I think maybe there's one more I'm missing, but we do. We integrate with all the LMSs. It's very nice that way for the student. It's single sign-on. All their grades are passed back. Like Frank mentioned, you don't have to do any kind of manual uploading and downloading. So yeah, that goes for Blackboard, Canvas, any of them. Somebody asked about cost. So we probably should have addressed that at the beginning. So zyBooks has sort of a national pricing model where all of our products cost the same. So our national price is $58. That includes access to everything for the semester. But if you see at the end of the chapter that Frank has open, there's a print chapter button. We actually do allow students to print our material or save it as a PDF. So that $58 gets them access to the content perpetually. It's just all the interactives and the grading is only there for the semester. So that's something to keep in mind. And then after this, you're going to get a little survey that's going to pop up in the browser. I'll also put it in the chat in just a few minutes. That's where you can let us know if you want evaluation access. So what Frank's showing right now is an evaluation copy. You can get your own, you can play in it, you can do all the questions like a student, you can make fake assignments. It is yours to do whatever you want in it. So you can kind of get the lay of the land. And then if you want to end up adopting it, it's a very simple process. You can adopt it right from your evaluation copy, or we can get your Zybooks rep in contact with you, but it's pretty simple. Oh, good. Lots of questions. Okay, Frank, these are probably for you.
Okay.
Students who have invested time into learning Java over 2 semesters in preparation for Android development. Are there any resources you can recommend that compares and contrasts Java to Kotlin that may help the students considering switching languages or remaining with Java?
Yeah, I don't have any resources that I personally use to compare the 2 languages. Our students are usually coming from a couple of semesters of C++ background. So while I'm reviewing the content on Kotlin, I mean, the Kotlin chapter here is written essentially not assuming that you had a background in any particular language. So it pretty much just assumes you've programmed before. So there's certain things that it doesn't define, thinking that you understand that programming concept. But it's really just kind of ignorant or makes no assumptions that you're coming from a particular language. So when I was teaching this to my students or just kind of reviewing it, I would say, here's how it's pretty different from C++. Some of my students have had a little bit of Java, so I might sometimes point out how it's similar or different from Java as well. But I really don't have a single resource I could point my students to. Kind of related to that, I've been asked, well, would this be a good book for somebody who hasn't ever programmed? Maybe they're just learning Java from scratch, or they're learning Kotlin from scratch. I would say that's going to be a rather big challenge, just because Android by itself already has a number of things you have to learn. And then when you add to that also trying to learn to just code, that's just a lot to try to get in maybe a single semester, maybe over a period of 2 semesters, where the first semester was focusing on just the language and programming concepts and just getting down how to create a loop that iterates a certain number of times. Then it'd probably be appropriate to move into then the Android application. But I don't know if I would try to do both at the same time in the same semester. I think you would find that students would get a little overwhelmed, and you wouldn't be able to make it very far into this particular book for sure.
Okay, that's great to know. And then we have a couple people just giving some feedback, and someone asked any chance for additional chapters in the future. So I won't put you on the spot, Frank, but I do want to really emphasize that that's exactly the point of these webinars. We want your feedback. We want to know what else you'd like to see. We want to know what you're using, what you're skipping. So I don't know if you know the plans for the future releases, but that's the kind of information that we take seriously. We collect it. We have a big repository of feedback from professors, and then we actually do make those changes. So I always like to emphasize that. And I'm sure you can speak to that, Frank, as these books have had multiple iterations.
Yes, the book has undergone quite a few changes over the last couple of years. Of course, this is the first version of the Kotlin version of the book, but Android is constantly evolving and best practices are constantly evolving. So that's something that I try to stay on top of. And there's even recently been a pretty major change how Google says is what Google thinks is best practices, involving getting data from a database or from a web API. So there definitely will be changes that will be made in the future. I try not to change too much with any one version, just because when you change too much, it's harder for instructors who have used your book, and then suddenly everything's changed the next version. But definitely we want to keep as current as we can. And every time Android Studio comes out with a new version, sometimes they rename menu items or move things around in the interface. And so we're very sensitive to those changes. And as soon as we start noticing, hey, there's students that are complaining or instructors that are saying, hey, these instructions don't line up with Android Studio, we immediately try to go in and update the text, push out those changes so that the text stays up to date as much as we can. It's a constant battle, as Android Studio just makes updates all the time, but definitely something we're very aware of, and we're trying to be nimble and trying to keep things as up to date as we can.
Awesome. And I think this came up earlier too, but any material on React Native? Are we?
Yeah, we don't really have anything on React Native right now. That's another way of developing Android apps. And it actually allows you to develop an Android app that would run on an iPhone as well as an Android device. But currently there's no plans to write material on that. We're definitely we're definitely open to maybe having that material in the future, but we just haven't committed to it yet.
Okay. And then this is a great question. Are the Kotlin and Java editions structured equivalently so that a professor in theory could use both, and where the students have a Java background, they could use that, Kotlin use the other? Are they the same chapter layout?
They are. Yeah, okay. That actually would not be a challenge at all. The only place where that would be a little bit of a challenge would be in the chapter here, working with data and running background tasks. So in the Kotlin version, Kotlin uses often coroutines to do background tasks. And so that's a little bit different. And I feel like there are also maybe a few differences here in working with data. I can't remember exactly the differences, but let's see, working with data. I think pretty much it's all the same and in the same order. And so it wouldn't be hard, but I definitely know that this chapter on background tasks, that's where things would be most different. But otherwise, yeah, you definitely could just have the same class, 2 different Zybooks, make the same reading assignments and everything. Yeah.
Yeah, cool. Okay. And like logistically, we could figure that out with the grade book and stuff. But yeah, very interesting. Any plans on a book on Flutter? This came up at SIGSI. It came up somewhere else. So again, I don't know if you know the answer to that, but on that note, we are always looking for contributors and authors too. So if you want to work with us and you think that you want to help, that's something we could explore too. Please note that on the survey if you are interested in working with us. I know somebody else was interested in Flutter as well. So I don't know if we have any.
Yeah, I don't know anything about it, but I definitely know that would be an interesting Zybook. Have a React Native, a Flutter. Those would be really good topics.
Cool. Any chance of getting a Maui Zybook? Is that how you say that? Maui, M-A-U-I? Do you know what that is?
I'm not sure what that is. M-A-U-I?
They just put it in the chat if you pull up the chat. Replacement for Xamarin? I don't know either. What's the
Yeah, I don't think I'm.
Randy, we can follow up with you. We'll figure out what you're what you're talking about.
So I know Xamarin. .NET Maui. Okay, so yeah, I'm not familiar with .NET Maui. Xamarin is a technology for that I think Microsoft has purchased a few years ago for developing mobile apps using C#, I believe. I hadn't really messed with it very much, but I would assume Maui is probably just the next version of that or something related to it.
Okay, cool. Any more questions? So I want to be respectful of everybody's time. So we'll hang out for a little bit if anyone wants to stick around and give questions. Once you close your Zoom, you should get a pop-up. That's the survey. I also put it in the chat, but I'll put it in here again. That's how we just make sure that we can follow up with you. If you want your own copy of either of these books or both, we can answer questions. And then all that feedback, if you can put it, there is a question of what improvements could you see in this product? And like I said, we really do take that very seriously, and it helps guide our next versions and releases. So someone said, I noticed there's no labs in this book. Do we have any plans for mobile app labs?
Yeah, we don't have any plans for that. So labs are in some of our other books like C++ and Java, where students can type the code directly into the lab and have it auto-graded. But we don't really have that as part of this book. And so I'm often asked, well, what do you do about like assignments? Often for my homework assignments, what I'll have students do is type in the code that's given in the book for these various apps. So for instance, the lights out, all of the code is given for creating this app. So I'll say, okay, go ahead and type in that bit of code. And then sometimes the Zybook has got places where it says, try this, right? So for instance, it says, could you add like a cheating mechanism within this game? So a student could just long press and then suddenly it solves. Could they add content descriptions, right? This would be for visually impaired users. So I will often just say, okay, take the app that you've written in the Zybook, make just a couple of minor changes to it, and then I'd like for you to demonstrate that first thing in class. So when class starts, I'll go around, they'll have it running on their emulators. I can very quickly come around, very quickly assess whether they've got the solution or not. And that way it saves me a lot of time grading. I don't have any auto-graded assignments at all. So just that quick walking around class, having students visually show me they're running apps. That's the way I primarily do homework assignments. And then with bigger projects that I assign, they're often similar to the apps that are in the Zybook, but also I want them to be very different. So for instance, I have students creating tic-tac-toe games and memory games that are similar, like the architecture to this lights out, but also very, very different. And I want them to be applying things like, starting up multiple activities and using intents and things that are learning outcomes from this particular chapter, but putting them to use in their own custom applications.
Awesome. And then you'll notice on this page too, that there's these light blue feedback buttons. These are in your copy, and they're also in students' copies of the book. So at any time, any activity, any typo, hopefully we don't have typos, but anything that is not clear or confusing, or you just have feedback about, you can click that button and it actually gets sent directly to our content team, and we'll link to that exact activity. So there's a feedback button for every little section. We really encourage you to use that too. Students use it a lot. These instructions were confusing, or I didn't know what to do. And those little changes we can make really quickly. So we really encourage people to use that function as well. It really does go somewhere, I promise. Daniel wants to know if your assignments are included if he adopts the book.
They're not, but I mean, if you wanted to contact me, shoot me an email. I'd be happy to email you back my assignments. I don't keep them secret or anything. They're just things I put into Canvas, and I'd be happy to share them with you.
Yeah. Will you put your email in the chat?
Sure.
And then someone said, if a student knows C++, how easy would it be for them to become proficient in Kotlin? Is that the background that your students have, C++?
Yes, that's exactly what my students are coming from. They've had maybe 2-3 semesters of C++ and maybe a little bit of Java, but we learned Kotlin in just a couple of weeks. It's not a terribly difficult to learn language. It has so many familiar similarities to the typical programming structures that you see in a high level language like C++ or Java, that it's not really all that hard.
Okay.
So yeah, they're up and going in 2 weeks, and then my students seem to really like the language.
Great. All right. So I think the chat's kind of slowed down. Like I said, we'll hang out for a few more minutes if anybody has any last minute questions or comments. I already see some people filling out the survey, so thank you. That's how we'll get back in touch with you. So Daniel said, I was hoping someone would bring this up. So he's teaching 270 students fully online. So Frank, I know you have a smaller class.
Yeah.
And then in person versus online is something we've had to bridge the last 2 years, especially. So he has 13 TAs, but it's a different setup than if you're just sitting in the classroom. So I agree. And that's something maybe we could work together and figure out. Daniel, I don't know what you do now for assignments, but kind of the idea of these Zybooks that don't have labs is that this is just your reading material, and whatever projects and assignments you already do, you could essentially keep, right? Like you probably wouldn't have to, I mean, unless you're switching languages, of course, but this is sort of the textbook portion of it. And then all your assignments could still remain the same.
That's right. And in an online environment, what you could do is you could have students that record their screens while they're using the emulator to demonstrate their app and how it's working. Just do little mini presentations via video and submit those videos. So I've had students do that when we've had to teach online at different times.
And if you COVID. Have TAs, which is awesome, our co-founder Frank uses a lot of TAs, and when he teaches online, he utilizes breakout rooms, Zoom breakouts. So 5 or 6 students go into a room with one TA and they do their examples, and then everybody comes back to the big room, quote unquote. So I do think there's creative ways to do it, but we would love to kind of go back and forth with you about that, because that is kind of the norm now. A lot of people are still teaching fully online. And so, all right. Any other questions? This was great, you guys. Thank you so much for all the feedback, all the questions. I know I've said it 10 times now, but we really take it to heart, and we really do make changes based on it. So any other questions? We'll hang out for about 1 more minute. Otherwise, please let us know what you thought. I hope you enjoyed your lunch. If you had any issues with lunch, you can email me and we'll get it figured out. I'll put my email in the chat too. Awesome. All right. Well, thank you all so much. Have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Frank.
All righty.